I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote lecturer tonight, Professor Alan Lightman. He will deliver a lecture about the discoveries, great breakthrough in 20th century science. And you can find the book in the lobby after the lecture, and a signing session will follow. Professor Lightman is currently professor of the practice of the humanities at MIT. He's a physicist and writer. He got a PhD in physics from Caltech. His scientific research has been in the areas of general relativity, radiation processes, and stellar dynamics. His literary essays and articles have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers. He wrote 6 novels, including Einstein Dreams, which has been translated into 30 languages, and The Diagnosis, a finalist for the National Book Award. Alan Lightman has served on the faculties of Harvard and the MIT, and was the very first person at MIT to receive a joint faculty appointment in the sciences and the humanities. Professor Lightman.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I wanted to thank Marie-Lo for inviting me in the first place and being so warm and hospitable to me during my visit here. I've had a great visit here as my first trip to Saudi Arabia. There's actually a close relationship between my university in the U.S., MIT, and KAUST, because when KAUST first opened in 2009, the former president of MIT gave the keynote lecture here. So I feel very much at home here, even though it's my first visit. And one of the most remarkable narratives in the history of science, Otto Loewi recalled how the idea first came to him for the ways that nerves communicate. This was in 1921, and I want to read just a little bit from his journal. The night before Easter Sunday of 1921, I awoke at 3 a.m., turned on the light, and jotted down a few notes on a tiny slip of paper. It was the design of an experiment to determine whether or not the hypothesis of chemical transmission of the nervous impulse from nerves to organs was true. I got up immediately, went to the laboratory, and performed a simple experiment on a frog heart according to the nocturnal design. Einstein had his thought experiments, and Rutherford had his damn fool ideas, but very few scientists in history have received their best ideas in a dream. About 10 years ago, I decided that I wanted to explore how discoveries happen. Is there any common pattern of discoveries? How do discoveries happen? Is there a difference between the personalities and styles of scientists who make great discoveries? So I asked leading astronomers, physicists, chemists, and biologists around the world to nominate the most important discoveries of the 20th century in their field. And I got a total of about 100 nominations. And I narrowed these down to about 25 based on my own judgment of the impact of the discovery. And so I wanted to tell you tonight a little bit about what I've learned from looking at these 25 discoveries, and I'll talk a little bit about the discoveries themselves. But first, getting back to Otto Loewi's dream in 1921, at that time it was known that a primary means of communication of the body within itself is the nervous system. That was known. It was also well known that the signals travel down individual nerves by electricity. What was not known was how nerves communicate signals to other nerves and to the organs. In other words, how do nerves talk to the rest of the body? Well, Lovey's late night experiment was not only simple, but it was elegant. What he did was he isolated the hearts of two frogs, and he removed the nerves from one of the hearts. Then he put a test tube into each heart and filled it with Ringer solution. I'm sure the biologists know very well what Ringer solution is. It's a solution that matches the concentration of salts in the body and can keep isolated organs alive. Lovey then stimulated the vagus nerve of the first heart. The vagus nerve causes the body to slow down, and sure enough, that heart's beating began to slow. Then he took the chemical in the test tube out of the first heart and poured it into the tube of the second heart without nerves, and that one too began slowing down, just as if its vagus nerve had been stimulated. Lovey had shown without a doubt that the manner in which nerves communicate is chemical, not electrical. He had discovered the so-called neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and adrenaline, and that finding has impacted everything from studies of the brain to neurological disease. Well, I would like to go now and give you a very brief summary of the 25 discoveries of the 20th century that I've chosen. But first, I want to go back to an earlier era of science before the 20th century, to a person who was considered the first theoretical physicist and credited with introducing the scientific method, and that is Al-Hassam ibn al-Haytham. The 1021 AD is the year that his great book on optics came out. I'm sure that many of you know who he is. He is called Alhazen in the West, and I went to your library today and saw your magnificent exhibition of Islamic science and saw that he is one of the featured scientists there, as he should be. He was born in Iraq, in Basra, and lived most of his life in Cairo. Among many discoveries that he made in mathematics, astronomy, and optics, he was the first person to explain how vision occurs. It occurs when light bounces off an object and then comes into the eye. And previously, it was thought that in vision, the light source originates in the eye. Alhazen's great book on optics was read by Galileo, sometimes considered the father of modern science in the West. And I wanted to read you just a couple of sentences that Alhazen had to say about the scientific method, which is, of course, what we all treasure today as modern scientists. Quote, and remember, this is in the 11th century, "The duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs critical examination so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency." It's wonderful to hear that he was thinking about that in the 11th century. So let me go now to the beginning of the 20th century with the great German physicist Max Planck, and almost all of the scientists that I'm going to feature here won the Nobel Prize, but not all of them. Planck discovered the quantum, and he did that because he had derived a formula that matched the radiation coming from a black body. It's a completely self-absorbing body that's heated up and has a little hole in the side, and you measure the energy spectrum that comes out of the hole, and that's called black body radiation. He derived a formula that fit that radiation, but he didn't understand where the formula came from on physical principles. And he found that only if the atoms and the walls of the box could get energy only in discrete units and steps, the quantum, that he could explain the energy spectrum. Next, two British physiologists in 1902, Starling and Bayliss, discovered the first human hormone. This was the second means by which the body communicates with itself via hormones after the nervous system. Starling and Bayliss they found that the scrapings from inside the intestine, when allowed to go through the bloodstream, again severing all the nerves, could stimulate the pancreas to excrete pancreatic juice to help in the digestive system. So they found that the nervous system was not part of this signaling, that there was a chemical substance inside the intestine which, when flowed through the blood, would signal the pancreas to begin its digestive secretions. Then we have Albert Einstein. In 1905, he proposed that light comes in the quanta that Planck had found. And I am allowing Einstein to have two discoveries in the 20th century. He also, as you all know, discovered or proposed the theory of special relativity. And in that theory, which was a theory of time and space, he began with a philosophical principle. Einstein was very philosophical. He began with the idea that the laws of physics should appear the same for all observers moving at constant velocity or in uniform motion. And from that principle, applying it to the laws of mechanics and electricity and magnetism, he figured out that our concepts of time and space had to change. He begins his great paper in the Annalen der Physik on special relativity, questioning the meaning of time with the innocence of a child. And I want to quote a sentence or two, and this is from Einstein's paper, translated from the German to the English. We have to take into account that all of our judgments about the world in which time plays a part are always judgments of simultaneous events. For example, if I say that train arrives here at 7 o'clock, I mean something like this: the pointing of the small hand of my watch to 7 and the arrival of the train are simultaneous events. That's actually taken from his technical paper in the Annalen der Physik. Well, let's go to 1911. The great physicist from New Zealand, Ernest Rutherford, first discovered the nucleus of the atom by bombarding gold atoms with subatomic particles and finding that they bounce back. Some of them bounce back at large angles as if hitting something hard. He deduced that most of the mass of the atom is concentrated in a very, very small region at its center. This picture of him, I don't know whether you can read it, but the sign over his head is "Talk softly, please." That's so that the voice would not disturb the sensitive equipment in his laboratory. The sign should have been directed at Rutherford himself because he had a booming voice and he was the loudest person in the lab by far. Going another year, the American astronomer Henrietta Leavitt discovered a new method for measuring the distance to the stars and giving astronomy the third dimension, and I'll talk a little bit more about her a little bit later. In 1912, the German physicist Max von Laue invented X-ray diffraction techniques, and I'm sure that some of you use X-ray diffraction in your work. And he used that technique to discover the arrangement of atoms and solid matter. He's sitting here in a sports car. Well, that was a sports car in 1912. He loved sports cars. He loved to drive fast. In fact, he killed himself in such a car at the age of 80. Next is the great Danish scientist Niels Bohr, who proposed the first quantum model of the atom, combining Planck's idea of the quantum with Einstein's idea of the photon of light, with Rutherford's discovery that most of the mass of the atom is at the center and the electrons orbit at great distances. I am actually a great grand student of Bohr, because my PhD thesis advisor was Kip Thorne, and Kip Thorne's PhD thesis advisor was John Wheeler, and Wheeler studied with Bohr in the 1930s. One of the things that I love about Bohr, something that he said, is that you should speak as clearly as you think, but not more so. I love that statement. Then we'll come to 1921 with Otto Levy. And when I'm finished going through these discoveries, I'm going to try to draw some conclusions about common patterns. We've already talked about Levy. In 1927, Werner Heisenberg developed one of the first full mathematical equations to describe the quantum world. He also proposed the uncertainty principle, which I think everybody's heard of, even the non-scientists here. The uncertainty principle follows from the wave-particle duality of nature, that everything in nature behaves partly like a wave that's spread out over a finite region and also like a particle that's located in one position. Linus Pauling, the chemist, using the new quantum physics, proposed the first quantum mechanical model of the chemical bond, showing how neighboring atoms can share electrons when they bond together. He solved equations for hybrid orbits of the electrons. He's the only scientist who both won a Nobel Prize in Science and a Nobel Prize for Peace. In 1929, Edwin Hubble, using the new 100-inch telescope in California, discovered evidence that the universe is expanding, leading to the Big Bang model. He did that by measuring the distances to galaxies and seeing that there was a proportionality between the distance and the speed at which they were flying away, and that mathematically means that the universe as a whole is expanding. Of course, really staggering philosophical and theological implications of the Big Bang, one being that the universe began about 15 billion years ago. Alexander Fleming, in 1929, discovered the first antibiotic, which of course has led to a lot of modern medicine. In 1937, the German scientist Hans Krebs discovered the sequence of chemical reactions by which energy is produced in all living cells, both in animals and plants. It's called the Krebs cycle. I'm sure that many of you studied that in school, and I'll say a little bit more about Krebs later, but I just wanted to mention that he was a modest person, and his father had very little respect for him when he was growing up. His father discouraged him, told him that he didn't have any brains in his head, and something that his father told him that Krebs wrote about in his autobiography. His father said, "You can't make a silk purse out of a cow's ear." Imagine a father saying that to his son. But Krebs went on to become a great scientist. In 1939, the German chemist Otto Hahn, working with the Austrian physicist Lise Meitner, discovered the fission of the atom. Working together in Germany, they bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons. One of the byproducts was barium, which Hans was able to detect by chemical methods, but he couldn't believe that a single neutron could split a giant uranium atom. It's like throwing a pebble at a brick wall and having it crumble. And it was Lisa Meitner that gave the theoretical explanation for how that could happen, that the nucleus of the atom is unstable. If you deform it slightly, the repulsive electrical forces will dominate the attractive nuclear forces, and it will deform even more and eventually split. When Meitner joined Hahn's Chemical Institute, his laboratory at the Chemical Institute in Berlin in 1909, women were not allowed in the building at that time. But Hahn had an extra laboratory in the basement. It was converted from a carpentry shop, and Meitner was allowed to work in the basement, but she could not go up to the higher levels of the building as Hahn could. In 1948, the American biologist Barbara McClintock, on the right there, discovered that genes could move around on chromosomes. They could change their position and thereby change their function. And before that, it was thought that genes were like fixed links on a chain, that they couldn't move. So this was enormously important for the development, understanding of the gene and the chromosome. In 1953, Rosalind Franklin, together with Watson and Crick, discovered the structure of DNA. And there's Crick and Watson. I'm sure that all of you know very well about that discovery. Crick and Watson shared the Nobel Prize. Franklin died a few years before the prize was awarded, so she was not eligible. In 1960, Max Perutz was the first person to unravel the three-dimensional structure of hemoglobin, which was the first protein to have its 3D structure unraveled. He did this by examining X-ray photographs, hundreds of X-ray photographs over a very long period of time. It took him 22 years to complete the project. In 1965, Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias found some static in their radio antenna, which you can see in the background. They didn't know what it was. They had eliminated all sources of experimental noise, the noise of the detector. At one point, they thought the static was caused by birds that had dropped poop into the antenna, which can create static. And the theorist, Robert Dicke, also an American scientist, told them that what they had discovered was the radiation left over from the Big Bang, the radio waves created in the Big Bang called the cosmic background radiation. This is an interesting story. Penzias and Wilson won the Nobel Prize for their discovery, even though it was an accident. They didn't know what they had found. Dicke, who explained what it was, did not share in the Nobel Prize. A few months later, if Dicke was working on his own detector of the cosmic background radiation, he knew what he was looking for, and he was only a few months behind the finding of Penzias and Wilson. So if their discovery had been delayed by just a few months, or his had been a little bit earlier, he would have been the first person to detect cosmic background radiation, and certainly would have won the Nobel. In 1967, the Pakistani physicist Abdul Salam found one of the first modern unified theories of physics. He found a single theory that unified the electromagnetic force and the weak nuclear force, showing that they were part of a single force. Of course, that has been the holy grail of physics since time immemorial, to find a smaller and smaller number of fundamental forces in particles. And Jerry Friedman in 1969 found that the atoms, the neutrons and protons in the atom were not elementary particles. He was able to split the proton and find that it was made out of 3 quarks, 3 smaller particles. He used a technique very much like Rutherford used in finding the nucleus of the atom. He bombarded protons and neutrons with very, very high energy electrons, and found that they scattered at large angles as if they had hit something hard inside the proton. And the last discovery that I'm going to mention from the 20th century was made by the Stanford physicist Paul Berg in 1972. He was the first person to use recombinant DNA techniques. He joined the DNA of a virus with the DNA of a bacteria and created a new organism that had never been found in nature before. So that, of course, was part of the beginning of the revolution in genetic engineering that we're in the middle of today, and we still don't know where that's going to lead. Well, let me now talk about one of the discoveries in a little more detail before I try to draw some inferences from all of them. And I wanted to talk about Henry Etta Leavitt's discovery of a method to measure the distances to stars. Not much is known about Henrietta Leavitt. She was very quiet. During her lifetime, she didn't win any prizes, any awards. She was never a professor. She was always just a lowly assistant. She was born in Massachusetts, one of 7 children and the daughter of a very devout Christian minister, and she was devout all of her life. She studied classics and astronomy at a small women's college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a college that later became Radcliffe, which later became part of Harvard University. And her entire life, she was called Ms. Leavitt. In 1895, she became a volunteer assistant at the Harvard College Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and that's what it looked like in 1895. You can see the observatory up here in the left-hand corner. That's where the telescope was. I know this observatory very well. I worked there myself for 10 years as an astrophysicist. And at that time, in the late 1800s, photography had just been invented. It was fairly new, and astronomers were beginning to attach cameras to the back end of telescopes and actually take photographs of the sky. And here's what one of those photographs looks like. Each one of those dots is a star, and the size of the dot tells you the brightness of the star. So there was suddenly an enormously huge amount of data to analyze. There wasn't before you had photographic plates attached to telescopes. So to painstakingly analyze this kind of data, to measure the position of each of those little tiny dots and how big it is, you need cheap labor. Well, where do you find cheap labor? Well, at the time, with women. Women are cheap labor. So the director of the Harvard College Observatory, a man named Edward Pickering, and there he is standing very magisterially in the left-hand corner, he hired a bunch of women to analyze these photographic plates. The women were called computers. So the problem that Leavitt was addressing was related to figuring out the distance to stars. And I said earlier, when you look up at the sky, you just see a two-dimensional picture. You don't know how far away those little dots of light are. Well, if all stars had the same intrinsic luminosity or wattage, then you would know that the ones that appeared dimmer were further away, and the ones that appeared brighter were closer. But we know that stars come in a wide range of wattages or intrinsic luminosity, and so you can't just tell how far away it is by how bright or dim it appears. For the very nearby stars, you can use a method called the parallax to measure how far away that is. And that involves seeing how much the angular position of the star shifts in the sky as the Earth moves from one side of the sun to the other. And the amount of angular shift tells you the distance to the star. but that only works for stars that are in our neighborhood, within a few light years of Earth. For all the other stars beyond that, you don't know how far away they are. And without knowing how far away an astronomical object is, you don't know very much about it. You don't know what it is. You don't know how much energy it's producing. You don't even know whether we're in a galaxy or not. You see a cluster of stars, you don't know whether it's a separate galaxy because you don't know the size of our galaxy. You don't know any of those things if you don't know the distance to the objects. There is a relationship between distance, intrinsic luminosity, and brightness. It's the inverse square law, so that if you know any two of those, distance, brightness, or intrinsic luminosity, you can deduce the third. But if all you're able to measure is brightness, and you don't have any way to measure the intrinsic luminosity, because that's a fundamental property of the star, then you can't get the distance. So Leavitt was given the task of analyzing a particular type of star called a Cepheid variable. Cepheid variable. And unlike the light from our sun, which is very constant in time, the light from a Cepheid variable varies in a periodic manner. It gets bright, then dim, then bright, as you can see here. And the time between two peaks in brightnesses for it to complete one cycle, one oscillation period, is called a period, the period of the Cepheid variable. And for this particular Cepheid variable here, you can see that the period is about 30 days. Well, Leavitt was assigned the task of measuring the periods of a group of Cepheid variables in the Small Magellanic Cloud. The Small Magellanic Cloud is a region of space where there are a lot of stars that are huddled very close together. And because they are huddled very close together, astronomers reason correctly that they must all be part of the same subsystem. They must be orbiting each other in their own gravity in a subsystem, and therefore they must all be about the same distance away from Earth. What Leavitt found was that the periods of these stars were proportional to their brightness. The brighter ones had a longer period. But because these stars in the Small Magellanic Cloud, these Cepheid variables, were all about the same distance away, then you know that the brighter ones actually have greater wattage. The distance, the unknown distance, sort of factors out of the equation because they're all at the same distance. So the dimmer ones actually have less intrinsic luminosity. The brighter ones have greater intrinsic luminosity. So what she had found in this correlation between brightness and period for this group of stars all the same distance is a fundamental relationship between the intrinsic luminosity of a star and its period. That has nothing to do with distance. That's a fundamental property of these Cepheid variables. It's as if now she had a way of determining the intrinsic luminosity, because the period is like a little flag on the star that tells you this is what my intrinsic luminosity, my wattage is. So then all you have to do is find one of those Cepheid variables nearby so that you can measure its distance by the parallax method. From its distance, you know its intrinsic luminosity. And then you have one data point on this curve to calibrate the entire curve. Now you have a solid relationship between intrinsic wattage and period for this particular group of stars. So here's how you use this as a distance, as your yardstick. Find a Cepheid variable anywhere else in the sky. Measure its period, which is easy to measure. Then use Henrietta Leavitt's graph, and from the period, read off its intrinsic wattage. Knowing its intrinsic wattage and how bright it appears then gives you the distance via the inverse square law. So Leavitt gave astronomy the third dimension. Her method of determining distances was used, first of all, to measure the size of our galaxy, which we know is around 100,000 light years. That is, it takes a light ray about 100,000 years to go from one side of the galaxy to the other. Astronomers then used this method to measure other clusters of stars and conclude that some of them were far beyond our galaxy. That is, they found a Cepheid variable in these other clusters, used Leavitt's method to measure their distance, and found that it was much more than 100,000 light years. So the distances to other galaxies was determined. In fact, the whole concept of a galaxy wasn't possible until we had Leavitt's method. Edwin Hubble, who discovered the expansion of the universe, used Henrietta Leavitt's method because he had to measure the distances to these galaxies, and it was the proportionality of their distance to their speed of recession from which he was able to deduce that the universe is expanding. So, and the entire Big Bang model is based on that. As I said, Leavitt did not even receive a professorship, let alone a big honor during her lifetime. She died at age 53 of cancer, and 3 years after she died, Professor Mataj Leffler of the Swedish Academy of Sciences wrote to her telling her that she was being nominated for a Nobel Prize, not realizing that she'd already been dead for 3 years. Well, I wanted now to just take a step back and look at all of these discoveries and create what I call a taxonomy of discovery. I want to see if the discoveries fall into different categories. And of course, in creating this taxonomy, I've used other discoveries other than the 25 that I looked at. The first category in my taxonomy is the accident. That's the discovery of Penzias and Wilson of the cosmic background radiation, Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin. The scientists find something that they're not looking for at all, and then either they or someone else explains the significance of what they've discovered. Then there's what I call the timely clue. And Barbara McClintock's discovery that genes could move around on chromosomes followed this pattern. What I call the timely clue. She was looking at the stripes on the leaves of corn plants. And she found that in some places there was a higher density of stripes, and in other places there was a lower than average density, and you can see that up here as well. And she found that a high density region was always next to a low density region. Well, she knew that this region and this region are formed by two different cells, neighboring cells, and she reasoned that this cell must have given something to that cell. And in fact, it was during the mitosis process, during cell division, when we have sister chromosomes, one chromosome gives a genetic element to another. And from there, she reasoned that maybe even on a single chromosome, the genetic elements could move around. So that was all started from this, what I call a timely clue, that she noticed this kind of pattern in the stripes on corn leaves. Then there is reasoning by analogy, the third category, when the scientist has made an earlier discovery or someone else has made an earlier discovery that bears some resemblance to a new problem that they're working on, and they reason by analogy. And Hans Krebs' discovery of the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, was based on analogy, because a number of years before that, Krebs had discovered the first cycle in biochemistry, the ornithine cycle. It's a cycle by which the body is rid of toxic ammonia in the form of excreting urea. You start with the chemical ornithine, you absorb ammonia, that's converted, ornithine is converted to citrulline, which is then converted to arginine, and then it's converted back into orthonine. So you have this cyclic process that goes round and round and round. And he had the idea of cycles in his mind. Well, then when he was studying the energy production in cells and trying to figure out how carbohydrates, fat, and protein eventually produce energy, and that's in the form of these very high-energy protons that are yielded here. Water and carbon dioxide are, of course, the waste products of metabolism. Several biologists knew that you started off with citrate, and you made aconitate and icositrate. But that's somewhere along here, the chemical reactions that were known, that was the end of the known chemical reactions. Krebs began thinking in terms of cycles because he had discovered the previous ornithine cycle, and he asked himself, are there other chemical reactions that can lead back to citrate? And that allowed him to speculate that these chemical reactions occurred, and of course he then later found them in the laboratory. So a wonderful process of thinking in terms of cycles and making a discovery by analogy. There is a fourth category, which is very rare, used mainly by theoretical physicists, which I call principles first, where the scientist begins with an idea, with a principle, like Einstein's principle that the laws of physics should be the same for all observers moving in constant motion, and then deducing the consequences of that principle. There is a related, also very rare idea, category that is, called the mathematical imperative. And again, this is used mainly by physicists to make discoveries, where it's the mathematics itself that guides you to the discovery. Paul Dirac's discovery of the positron and the equation that describes the electron was such an example. He was trying to find an equation that combined quantum physics with Einstein's special relativity, and found that the mathematics was very restrictive. There were the only equations of a very small mathematical form would allow the consistency of quantum physics and special relativity. He found that equation, and then one of the consequences of that equation was the prediction of antimatter. The antiparticle of the electron is the positron. He made the prediction based upon his equation, and then a few years later, it was discovered. There is, I keep clicking, but I'm really don't have any more slides. There is the category of new tools, where new technology that was not available before becomes available. And I saw today a laboratory where you have some new technology that I haven't seen before. Hubble's discovery of the expansion of the universe used the new 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, California. He had exclusive use for that telescope, and it came online only a few years before he began using it. And finally, the last category is what I call the long haul. There's no sudden breakthrough, no sudden timely clue, no principles first, but the scientist is just committed to a problem and works on it for many years and finally makes the discovery. And Max Perutze's discovery of the three-dimensional structure of hemoglobin follows that pattern. He worked on that for 22 years, as I said before, examining hundreds of X-ray photographs. So just to summarize the 7 categories: the accident, the timely clue, analogy, principles first, the mathematical imperative, new tools, and the long haul or persistence. Well, are there any common patterns in all of these discoveries? Of course, there's a wide range of processes in scientific discovery. But in most discoveries, there's a kind of synthesis involved where strands from different fields, sometimes unrelated, are brought together to produce something new. An example of that was Bohr's discovery of proposal of the quantum model of the atom, where he combined Planck's idea of the quantum with Einstein's idea of the photon, with Rutherford's discovery of the nucleus of the atom. Watson and Crick combined Franklin's X-ray photographs with a suggestion by their colleague Jerry Donahue that the hydrogen atoms on the bases, adenine, guanine, and so on, that those positions were wrong in the literature. They were in different places, and that allowed the bases to fit together in a different way. Again, a synthesis of different ideas. Well, there's another pattern that happens in many scientific discoveries, not all, but many, and it's the following three-step creative process. You start with a prepared mind. That is, the scientist has done his or her homework. They've mastered the tools of their profession. They've mastered the craft, and they're working on a problem. You then have a prepared mind. The second step in this creative process is getting stuck. Getting stuck is immensely important in the scientific creative process. When you're stuck, your subconscious mind roams over a large range of possibilities. And I think that that subconscious mind is a catalyst for creative thought. Lisa Meitner's understanding of nuclear fission followed a period when she was stuck. Barbara McClintock's discovery that genes could move around on chromosomes followed a period of being stuck. She was trying to figure out how genes could turn on and off in the lifetime of a single organism. Planck's discovery of the quantum came after being stuck. Crick and Watson were stuck for a long time before the discovery of the structure of DNA. The prepared mind is critical. I don't know of any discoveries in the 20th century, any great discoveries that came from amateurs. The prepared mind is important even when the discovery is an accident. And I also think that being stuck is extremely important. And I know that most of you are graduate students, there's some postdocs, and a lot of students that I have met feel that being stuck is a failure, that you have failed when you were stuck. But I want to tell you that you should welcome being stuck because it's part of the creative process. Many of these great discoveries came after the scientist was stuck. That's when your creative process is working the hardest, even at the subconscious level. So don't worry when you're stuck. You might be on the verge of figuring out the problem and making a discovery. I want to end by saying that, and this is one of the things that I learned from my study of these discoveries, is that there is no single universal scientific personality. Scientists come in as wide a range of personalities as non-scientists. Scientists can be bold and confident like Rutherford or Einstein, and scientists can also be modest and quiet like Krebs and Meitner. William Bayliss, who discovered the first human hormone in 1902, was cautious, careful, meticulous, in love with the details, and his partner, Ernest Starling, was brisk, impatient, in a hurry to get to the big picture, and yet they worked together very well. What all of these men and women share, independent of their individual personalities, is they share a passion to know, a sheer pleasure in solving problems, and an independence of mind. When Lisa Meitner, who discovered the fission, the reason why atoms can be split by neutrons, when she was a little girl, she was Jewish in Austria, and her grandmother told her that she should not sew on the Sabbath. It was bad luck to sew on the Sabbath. The heavens would come falling down. So the little girl decided to do an experiment. The next Sabbath, she just lightly touched her knitting needle to the thread, looked up, and nothing happened. Then she took one stitch, waited, looked up, nothing happened. And then she began sewing. She decided that her grandmother must be mistaken in her belief, and she began happily sewing. Thank you.
So questions from the audience?
What do you think has been the greatest scientific breakthrough of this century?
Of the 21st century? I don't think there's been enough time to give a real analysis. At the very end of the 20th century, astronomers discovered that the universe is accelerating, not decelerating, caused by the so-called dark energy. And that is a very, very important discovery. I don't know whether it's the most important discovery of the 21st century, but certainly one of the very important ones. You notice that I stopped in 1972 with my great discoveries of the 20th century. I think that you need a certain amount of time to know the importance of a new discovery.
So you talked about 7 different, I don't know if you want to call them approaches to these discoveries. And I was curious if you found any relationship to the styles of discoveries with the different fields that they were related to.
Oh, that's a great question. No, I didn't see any correlation, except for the fact that the discoveries that were more philosophically based, that started with a principle, you were more likely to find those in theoretical physics than in biology or chemistry. But other than that, I think that the styles are similar. I think that if you want to compare physicists and biologists, that physicists are more reductionists than biologists. They try to reduce complex phenomena into extremely simple processes, like a pendulum swinging back on a string, whereas I think the biologists see nature more in terms of systems. Knowing how the structure of a single atom, that doesn't help you get you very far in biology. It's how atoms combine with molecules and how molecules participate in various systems. So I think that biology is a little more system-oriented, physics is a little more reductionist. But I think in terms of the styles of working, I couldn't say that there's a difference going from one field to another. I think the personality and the variation of the individual is more important.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much. A most interesting talk. You made a remark there that there are very few amateurs who have made significant contributions in science. Mm-hmm. I hate to trot out the old Einstein, 1905 again, but there he was working as a patent clerk and thinking. And in that 1905-1906 period came up with, I think it was 5 or 6 revolutionary papers. And yet when he was a professor, much later, his productivity went down. I wonder if sometimes professors have too much administration work to do.
Let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, in theoretical physics, scientists peak at a younger age than any other field. So a lot of theoretical physicists do their best work when they're in their 20s, if you look at the age they were when they did the work. Secondly, even at the age of 25, Einstein was already very, very advanced in physics. He had mastered all of the physics that had been done up to that point in history. So he had read the text. You can see in his letters that he understood the principles. If you look at his paper on one of the 5 papers that you mentioned, the paper on Brownian motion, the observation that very small dust particles move around in a microscope, and that's evidence for molecular collisions, and from that he deduced actually the size of an atom. If you look at the mathematics in that paper, and the knowledge of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, it's far beyond what most graduate students in physics get today. So I would not call him an amateur by any means. Even though he learned a lot of what he knew on his own, he was a very thorough student of physics.
What about discoveries in social science and humanities?
Yes, well, I know very little about social science, and there are probably people here who know more than I do. I wouldn't even venture. If you asked me to find out some of the major discoveries in social science, I would talk to leading social scientists, historians, psychologists, and so on, but I wouldn't claim to understand that myself. I'm sorry that I'm disappointing you on that.
Which discoveries do you think are more important, the ones at the start or the ones at the end of the 21st century?
I couldn't say. I would say that if you put a gun to my head and said, pick the 2 most important discoveries out of all of the 100, I would probably pick Einstein's discovery of relativity, which completely changed our notion of time and space, and Franklin, Watson, and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA, which has led to a revolution which is still not over. So one came in 1905 and one in 1953.
Thank you very much for the talk. Did you notice any correlation between the environment and the ability to generate those great ideas? I'm thinking of places like the Bell Labs, where we had 7 Nobel Prizes.
Yes, I think that in most cases, an encouraging environment helped, but not always. For example, in the case of Hans Krebs, where he was strongly discouraged by his father, he still went on to make a great discovery. I think that many of these men and women, they overcame their environment, and there was a passion in them for science and a commitment that drove them. And I agree that environment does matter, but I can see many examples where the scientist was in a difficult environment and overcame it. Edwin Hubble's father wanted him to be a lawyer and put a lot of pressure on him to join the family law firm. But he resisted that pressure because he was really interested in astronomy.
Thank you very much for your talk. So now that you have a taxonomy of the discovery process, what conclusion can you give in terms of advice to institutions, to universities, to research centers, whatever, in the way that they can help to create the right environment to promote this this scientific process? What are the best practices that you can advise or whatever?
Well, I don't think that the taxonomy necessarily leads to advice for the environment. I think, first of all, that women should be encouraged in science, and I know that you have many women here, but worldwide, women are not encouraged nearly as much as men are to go into science and technology, so I think that's something that we can work on. I think that from what I've seen at CalSTAR, you have a really unique environment. where the students support each other, they talk to each other, there's excitement, there's exchange of ideas, there's cutting-edge technology, and I can't imagine an environment better for discovery than the one that you have here.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Do you feel that there was like a specific discovery that kind of led to most of the discoveries you talked about here?
No, but I think the whole idea that nature is lawful and that the laws of nature are discoverable, can be discovered by the human mind, I think those ideas led to all of the discoveries that I mentioned. And those ideas started with Alhazen, as I mentioned, who talked about the skepticism that scientists should have towards everything. You must verify everything for yourself. You have to doubt even yourself. And then I think Isaac Newton was I would say that he was, for me, the most important person in suggesting that nature is lawful, that it is rational, that it obeys laws that we can discover. The interesting thing about Newton is that even Newton was a strong believer in God. And at the end of his Principia and the General Scholium, after he has given all of these magnificent new laws of motion and laws of gravity, showing how the planet should move, he says that because of friction, the orbits of the planets would gradually dissipate, and you need the divine hand of God to keep everything spinning around. Of course, a couple of centuries later, the French physicist Laplace showed that the orbits are stable. They're not going to dissipate due to friction. But I think it's interesting that you have a mind like Newton who believed very much in the lawfulness of the natural world, and yet at the same time was a devout believer in God.
Thank you for an interesting talk and interesting topic. So how do you see the future of discovery? Will your taxonomy still be true, or will we discover new ways of discovering things? So say, for example, the rise of machine intelligence. So in your mode of investigation, do you see areas more amenable for being augmented by such tools?
Well,
so for example, being stuck and exploring options?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Let me say two things about that. One is that I think that machines and robots can assist in the mechanical aspects of science, but I think we're still a long way from machines being able to think like a scientist. It's certainly not impossible, but I think we're a long way from that. The other thing I would mention, in comparing the past with the future in science, and of course I'm not an expert on any of this, but one trend that has happened is that 100 years ago, you could have one or two scientists working alone at their lab bench and they could make an important discovery. And that's very hard to do today because the forefronts of science have moved to a point where we need expensive technology. And we usually have larger teams of scientists working together to make a discovery. In astronomy, a lot of the discoveries today are made with telescopes mounted on satellites. And discoveries in physics are made by large teams of scientists working in the atom smashers. And it's much rarer today to see really important scientific papers with only one or two authors on the paper. So I think that there's been a trend created by increasing technology and the cost of that technology for there to be larger teams of scientists working together. And one question that raises in my mind is if you are a young person going into science today, and I know all of you are young people going into science or already scientists, I wonder whether it affects your motivation knowing that you might be part of a large team and have 10 other names on the scientific paper that you publish rather than being a single agent working by yourself. That's a sociological and psychological question, but I just throw that out there for you.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting lecture. I wanted to ask about the discoveries in mathematics. So certainly, probably in 19th century, they were very crucial ones that some of them actually were the playground for the special relativity and etc. What about the 20th century, like the mathematical discoveries in 20th century?
Well, of course, I didn't try to collect from great mathematicians what were some of the great mathematical discoveries. I know that about 15 years ago that the Princeton mathematician, was his name Andrew Weil, proved the proved Fermat's last theorem, which mathematicians had been trying to prove it for 300 years. And proving that, he had to develop and create several new branches of mathematics. So I know that would be on the list of great mathematical discoveries of the 20th century. But I'm not a mathematician. If you are, you probably have a much better idea of what are the other great discoveries in math of the 20th century.
How do you think, is this process infinite, or given enough time, scientific discovery process will converge and humanity will possess ultimate knowledge?
I don't know. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, this is on some comments that you said before. One was that you mentioned that most of the, all these people have overcome their environment and succeeded their environment. But on the other hand, you were talking about the collaboration of people nowadays and teams coming up and solving problems. And I think that actually in your presentation, we saw that a lot of these problems have also been solved by teams and by collaborations of people. So my question would be, what do you think is more important, also maybe in the context of our time now? Is it competition in science, which has been driven by some people? Or is it actually collaboration and teamwork that makes us strong?
That's a great question. First of all, the teams that I mentioned were very small teams, much different from the large teams of the 21st century. But it's a wonderful question. How do you rate competition and collaboration? How do you compare the two? I don't really know the answer to that. I think collaboration is always a good thing, but competition can be a good thing too. We know that in capitalism, that the principle of competition is what leads to lower prices. And I think two labs in competition with each other might be motivated to produce better equipment or to work harder hours. In the discovery of DNA, I know that Watson and Crick were competing furiously with Linus Pauling in the US, who was also working on the structure of DNA. So it's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, and I would think that it would vary from one situation to the next. I don't imagine that there are separate groups at KAUST that are competing with each other, but you might find yourself competing with groups in other universities or in other countries. And I think that's both good and bad. So it's a great question, it's a complicated question, and I don't have the answer to it.